Everyone, I'm Nancy Stula. I'm the director of the Benton Museum. Thank you all for joining us here on Zoom for our virtual gallery talk, Saving the Nut Museum and Other Nutty Adventures in Art History with Christopher Steiner. This talk is offered by the William Benton Museum of Art in coordination with the exhibition Remembering the Nut Museum, the Visionary Art of Elizabeth Tashjian. It's curated by Chris Steiner, and it runs just a few more weeks until March 11th. So I encourage you all to stop in and see this exhibition before it closes. I do want to remind everyone that the museum is open every day except Mondays, and admission is always free. Please note that masks are still required indoors. Our speaker tonight, Christopher Steiner, is the Lucy C. McDaniel Professor of Art History and Anthropology at Connecticut College in New London. He's also the director of Kahn's Museum Studies certificate program. He holds an undergraduate degree from Johns Hopkins, a PhD from Harvard, and his areas of expertise include African art and material culture, censorship in museums, images of race and otherness in visual culture, and of course, offbeat museums and visionary art. He is currently writing a book on the Nut Museum titled Performing the Nut Museum. There will be a question and answer session after the talk, so please pose your questions in the Q&A box and I'll read them after the talk. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Chris Steiner.
Thank you, Nancy, for the nice introduction, and thank you, Amanda, for making all of this technology work. As you know, this is a Zoom webinar, so unlike regular Zoom, I can't see the audience, which is making it even stranger than regular Zoom. But hopefully it will be just fine. I'm going to start by sharing my PowerPoint, and then I'll tell you a little bit about what my talk will consist of this evening. All right, so you should be able to see the title screen of my presentation. The title is a little misleading. I wanted it to be kind of a catchy title, so I called it Saving the Nut Museum and Other Nutty Adventures in Art History, but as you can imagine, there's really been nothing nuttier that I've ever done than Saving the Nut Museum. So that will be my primary nutty adventure that I will be talking about this evening. Whoops. All right, I used to know how to advance this. There we go. So I'm going to talk about four topics essentially, or three topics really. I'm going to give you an overview of the exhibition sections. And this was billed as kind of a gallery talk. So even though we're virtual, and I'm virtually in the gallery, thanks to the virtual backdrop, I will kind of walk through different sections of the exhibition and give you some information about each of those sections. I'll talk a little bit about my work in Saving the Nut Museum, which started in 2002, and then I'll talk a little bit about the legacy of the archive and the collection today, and what's been happening with it since 2002. And then, of course, I'll be happy to take questions at the end. In the exhibition, there is a case that we call the biography case, which is sort of a representation of Elizabeth Tashjian's life from when she was a child, born in 1912, up until the end of her life in 2007. And all of the material in the exhibition and all the material I'm showing you this evening are from material that were essentially rescued from Miss Tashjian's home in 2002, when the home was put up for sale and she was removed from the home for reasons I'll get into later in the talk. Elizabeth's parents both came from Armenia, although they didn't know each other in Armenia. They met in New York City at the beginning of the 20th century. This is her mother as a child, Elizabeth Tashjian, that you see on the far right. And her father, M.J. Tashjian, arrived on a steamship in 1904 into New York City, where he met Elmas a few years later. Elizabeth was born December 24th, 1912. And in the archive, we have many family baby pictures and family albums. And her father was a very successful rug merchant who had a store first on the Upper West Side, and then on Fifth Avenue, and then later in Los Angeles. So the point of showing you this is that Elizabeth grew up in a fairly wealthy upper middle class household in New York City on the Upper West Side. She lived a happy, normal childhood, as you can see in this Christmas picture. And sadly, in 1922, or actually a little before that, my date is wrong there. At the age of 7, Elizabeth, Elmas and MJ Tashjian divorced. And I think this picture is kind of poignant in the sense that I think that was he on the far left who was cut out of the photograph. So starting at age 7, Elizabeth was really raised by her mother in New York City and grew very close to her mother, who she lived with for her entire life. Elizabeth went to Robert Louis Stevenson School for Girls in New York City, and she was known particularly for her proficiency as a violinist. And you can see this is her senior yearbook, where she was listed by her middle name, Yasa, which was her nickname, and was remembered for her violin virtuosity. Right after graduating from high school, she went to the New York School of Applied Design for Women, which she began in 1932. And there she studied mural painting and book cover design, which was something that she carried through her entire life, really. She was interested in designing murals and painting murals, some of which she actually painted in her home in Old Lyme. She was taken under the wing of an art teacher at the School of Applied Design, a man named George Baer. And even after she graduated from the New York School of Applied Design, she took private lessons for many years from George Baer. And you can see an example of his work on the left side of this screen. This is the first work that Elizabeth did in 1936 that was devoted to the theme of nuts. And of course, one of the questions that always comes up when talking about Elizabeth Tashjian and talking about the Nut Museum is, why did she become so fascinated by nuts? And unfortunately, it's a difficult question to answer. I asked her many times when she was alive. Other people asked her many times. And her typical answer was that as a child, her mother had bowls and bowls of nuts around the house, and that she was always fascinated by nuts. Well, I mean, that's an interesting response, but that doesn't lead to answering why do you devote your life to nuts. She did say that she did crack open a walnut one day, and when she cut the walnut in half, she thought it was absolutely beautiful, the inside, and she painted it. And this is from that same period, 1936. This is a pastel called A Flame, where you can see there are walnuts and a walnut pick and a small statue positioned on a cloth backdrop. She carried that theme of nut painting throughout her career, beginning in the mid 1930s. This is another painting from around the same time, 1937, Nutcracker Suite, where you can see she's kind of playing with the idea of her interest in music and her interest in the visual arts. And the backdrop, and it's hard to tell, is actually an Armenian cloth. So she was also interested in trying to kind of weave her Armenian background and her Armenian identity into her paintings. And she talked often about the fact that many varieties of nuts, including almonds, had their origins in that part of the world as well. She began to also do these more abstract works in the 1930s. This is called Wally at Sea, which is a walnut floating in water. So you can also begin to see some of her sense of humor just in the title of the painting. And this is a highly magnified walnut floating on a sea. And in 1938, she attended the National Academy of Design, a very prestigious, probably the most prestigious art school at the time, and went through all of their coursework from life drawing to still life drawing, etc. And she had her first solo exhibition at the time that she entered the National Academy at age 26 at the Tricker Gallery on West 57th Street. And in fact, when you go to the exhibition, if you've been or if you have a chance to go, you'll see that one of the main display walls has many of those paintings that were actually in that 1938 exhibition, which she called the shell set. So this was, again, her paintings devoted to nuts, and she had a whole subcategory of painting called the shell set, which we've recreated in the gallery at the Benton Museum. She had a studio on 57th Street, across the street, actually, from the Tricker Gallery at Carnegie Hall. And when she first told me this during an interview, I had no idea that there were art studios in Carnegie Hall. And it turned out that, in fact, on the top floor, the 8th floor of Carnegie Hall, there were painting studios, which she maintained for over a decade, painting in New York City. This is a photograph of Elizabeth in the Carnegie Hall studio, and you can also see behind her one of her most monumental paintings, the Christian Science Mother Church in Boston, which took her several years to complete. I should have mentioned, or we'll come back to this maybe more in the Q&A, but Elizabeth was a devout Christian scientist, as was her mother, and Christian Science kind of figures, I think, in the way Elizabeth talks about her art, talks about nuts, talks about the Nut Museum. And we can come back to that if anyone's interested in the question period. In terms of her style, you can see, I think, the influence of George Behr, particularly if you look at these two self-portraits side by side. The self-portrait with violin from 1949, which is in the Benton show, and this self-portrait of George Behr. And if you sort of focus in on their faces and the way she painted her face, I think there are some really striking similarities between her work and her mentor's work. She did not paint only nuts. She did explore other themes. And this is, I think, one of her greatest paintings called Blue Bridge, which is in Central Park, which she painted in 1949. And again, if you look at George Behr's landscape work, you can see the influence pretty strongly in terms of the way she painted the buildings and painted the environment. Although she claims to have not really been influenced by any artists, she liked to say that she lived in her own ideas and her own mind and didn't go to museums and had no interest in in learning about other artists. She did know something about surrealism, and I would argue that some of her work was influenced by the surrealists that she must have seen in New York City when she was in art school. And if you look in particular at this painting by Max Ernst, Oedipus Rex from 1922, and compare it to this large mural, which unfortunately is no longer in existence. It got water damaged and destroyed in the 1980s. You can see, the way she paints her hand with the nut in it, I would argue, is related to the influence of surrealism and Max Ernst. And I talked to her in my interviews about surrealism and Dali, and she told me once, I like Dali, but instead of having a snail on his head, let's say I have my nuts, so mine makes more sense. I love Dali's work. Some of it, is a little cuckoo. So I think she admired Dali for his nuttiness, although she claimed to be less nutty. Whoops. I don't think the sound will work on Zoom. In 1950, she and her mother moved to Old Lyme, and they purchased this really substantial house on Ferry Road, which was known as the Chadwick Cottage, which had been there since the late 19th century. And the previous owner was Bertha Chadwick Trowbridge, who was also known to be a kind of eccentric woman who lived alone in that house. So there's this sort of interesting, I think, legacy of eccentric women who have lived in this Ferry Road house over the years. Elizabeth painted landscapes. She called the house Elia, was the name of the house that she and her mother gave to the estate. And here you can see her in 1952 painting the view from their house on Ferry Road. In 1959, Elizabeth's mother passed away, which I think was a terrible blow to Elizabeth, who had never lived with anybody else. She was never married. She had no siblings, and she was now left within this enormous house by herself for the first time without her mother. And, that posed a problem both emotionally, but I think it also posed a problem financially, that how was she going to maintain this house on her own? And by the late 60s, she started to explore ways of making money with her art. She took a hooked rug class in the late 60s and started to make these rug hookings of her cat. You can see, it's a little hard to tell, but you can see this is her cat, the real cat, and then these are hooked rugs, renditions of her cat. She's also wearing, in this image, a kind of bib. She would create these kind of hooked rug bibs of a cat with eyes. She tried to have an exhibition in 1969 in her home where she would sell these hooked panels as a way of making money, although, as you can imagine, this was not a major moneymaker for her. But I think it introduced the idea of the possibility that her home could be open to the public as a museum. So I think kind of that the germ of that idea that this was a potential museum space starts with the hooked panel exhibition in 1969. And then on April 22, 1972, she opens the Nut Museum to the public. And I also wanted to mention that, one of the exciting things about the Benton exhibition is that it is timed to be the 50th anniversary of the opening of the Nut Museum, right? So it's quite a great timing to celebrate and remember that it's been 50 years since the Nut Museum opened. Elizabeth took what had been the dining room, which you see on the left, and converted that into the main display gallery of the Nut Museum, where she had displays of nuts and her paintings and nutcrackers, and also gave tours of the Nut Museum. It was not the kind of museum you could go to on your own and read labels. Every visit to the Nut Museum was a guided tour by Elizabeth herself. She, again, was trying to make money, but I don't think she made much money. The admission originally was one nut and $1, which you put in this admission box, which you see on the right. And by the time the museum closed in 2001, 2002, she had raised it to $3 and a nut. If you didn't have a nut, she had black walnut trees on her property, and you would be asked to go back outside and find a nut on the ground to put in the admission box. She always wore this purple gown, which she's wearing in this photograph, which was her grandmother's wedding dress from Armenia. So again, there's that connection that she would try to draw between nuts and the Nut Museum and her Armenian heritage. And when you went into the museum, as I said, it was a guided tour, and each little section was almost set up as a kind of prompt where she could launch into one of her stories or anecdotes or lessons about nuts. So this is one example of that, where you see this is a glass table where she has laid out some nuts. She has a small religious text on the table. She has a hooked rug that she made here of a nut sliced in half. And interestingly, she has this pocket watch. And, if you're wondering why is the pocket watch on the table, when you got up to this station, as it were, in the museum tour, Elizabeth would say, "Look, there's a clock on the table. Does anyone know why?" And of course, the visitors would shake their heads and say no. And she would say, "Because it's time to talk about nuts." So she had all of these little devices that she would use and use them repeatedly. So the tours were, highly scripted, very little impromptu. And this was one of the prompts that would then let her begin to talk about what you see on the table. One of the things I teach in my museum studies classes is the origins of museums, going back to the Renaissance. And in many ways, I think you could make the argument that the Nut Museum was a kind of cabinet of curiosities, right? So Elizabeth brought together these oddities from around the world, and she would tell interesting stories about them, which is what the owners of cabinets of curiosities in the Renaissance were expected to do. The other name for cabinets of curiosities is cabinets of wonder. And I think the other part that really interests me about the Nut Museum is this idea that it was it inspired wonder and awe in visitors, and that it always kept you slightly off balance, that you never quite knew, is she putting me on? Is she serious? Are these anecdotes, is there truth to these anecdotes? So there was this kind of bewilderment, this kind of instability of the rational world, which is what I think cabinets of curiosities were trying to do, destabilize the rational world. And I think in many ways, the Nut Museum also destabilized the rational world. At the Benton installation, you can see in this image on the right, we recreated this exact photograph on the left, which was taken in 1975, of Elizabeth in the main exhibition space of the museum, that is the dining room. And when I saved the museum, which I'll say more about in a few minutes, I was able to basically rescue everything that was in that dining room with the eye of being able ultimately to recreate the space. So this is really a very exact replica, including the purple gown, which you now see in color rather than in black and white. When the museum opened, Elizabeth had this enormous explosion of creativity. A lot happened between 1972 and 1976, 77, where she is so excited to have people coming into the house, sharing her passion for nuts, sharing her art. She has this, as I said, explosion of creativity. And one of the first things she does in 1973 is to organize the first annual Nut Ball, where she invited the local Cub Scouts and Brownies to her house for a tour. They had food together. They played Roll the Coconuts outside. She had them march and sing a song through the house. And it was this tremendous excitement for her to be able to do that. Unfortunately, I said it's the first annual. It's also the only annual. I don't think she ever did it again. But it was for her, it was a real kind of turning point of establishing the museum as a public institution. She composed two songs in 1973, Nuts Are Beautiful and The March of the Nuts, which when you went to the museum, she would sing a cappella one of those songs for you. And if you go to the Benton Museum, you can hear in a continuous loop her singing both of those songs. I'm just going to pause out of my PowerPoint here so I can play you a little clip of Elizabeth singing Nuts Are Beautiful, because no talk on the Nut Museum would be complete without hearing that song.
Oh, nobody ever thinks about nuts. Nuts can be so beautiful if looked aright. Take some home and handle them properly, artistically, and feel a new taste being born.
All right, I'm going to go back to my PowerPoint. That was only the first stanza. There's 5 more. So the song, composing the songs was part of this burst of creativity. And, whoops, sorry.
Uh,
She also made nut masks in the early 70s after the museum opened. And these were a series of masks in the shape of different nuts. The masks were fashioned out of foam rubber as well as paper mache. And at the end of the tour, she would take the visitors into the ballroom, which was next to the dining room, where all of these masks were laid out on a couch. And she would put different masks on and quiz museum visitors about what type of mask, what type of nut she was impersonating. The one she's holding in the image that you see on the screen here is called Almond Eye Bags. And that's because it has, well, it represents an almond, and you can see the almonds are under the eyes, as in the eye bags. If you go to the show at the Benton, you can see a selection of these masks on display, as well as this fabulous enlargement of Elizabeth sitting on that couch where the masks were displayed for visitors to the Nut Museum. She also started to work in metal, sheet aluminum, and made sculptures. She created the world's largest nutcracker, which hung outside on the grounds of the Nut Museum, and visitors could pose for photographs with it. And then she also made sculptures that were hanging throughout the dining room and throughout the ballroom that you could see when you were visiting the museum. This was a piece called Nuts Nourish Man from 1980. And as you can see, it's a representation of a woman with coconut breasts. This is probably her most risque piece. This is Nuts Grew in the Garden of Eden, also from 1980, which represents a male torso with two black walnuts suspended from aluminum wires. So she played with the many meanings of the word nut, nut as in the nuts we eat, nuts as in being slightly nuts or crazy, and then the third version of nuts, which you see there. The exhibition has a selection of her sheet metal sculptures, which you can see on display. The other thing that's interesting when I talked to her about the creation of these sculptures, they're very sharp, and I've actually cut myself in moving them around. And she said that she would cut them with bare hands with scissors and never cut herself. And she said that's because her hand was guided by God, and that God protected her while she was making these sheet metal sculptures. One of the categories that we explore in the exhibition is anthropomorphism, the idea that nuts being represented as people. And the first example of that is fairly early. So in the 1930s, when she's starting the National Academy of Design, she does do this still life composition called The Speaker. And it represents a Brazil nut that's been opened up. And the Brazil nut, you can see here, looks like it has a human face inside. When she cut the Brazil nut open, she saw a human face. So she positioned the Brazil nut on a little wooden box, giving it a podium, and then gave it a glass of water. And she entitled it The Speaker. She didn't pursue this idea of anthropomorphism until much later, again in the 70s when the museum is open. And here you get a radically different view of anthropomorphic nuts, where she's really exploring this idea of people with nut faces and chestnut faces and so on. These are some early sketches she did. And then the more developed works came in the mid 70s, 1975, this pastel on paper, acrylic on paper, chestnut head, which was, she said, was directly inspired by having seen the painting on the right by Jamie Wyeth of Pumpkinhead, which he completed in 1972. This painting is also in the exhibition, Chestnut Face from 1975. And when I interviewed her about this particular painting, Elizabeth said, "I remember being in the kitchen late at night with all the lights blazing, and suddenly it came to me. I can't tell you what it was like. I thought I was going crazy. These artists that do these things do it with drugs, but I got there on my own. I really took off with this one and went to Mars." So, something happened clearly in the early 70s to her style of art. It's not entirely clear where she got that inspiration, but it's radically different from what she was doing with George Baer and doing at the National Academy of Design. This also led to her creation of these 5 large panel paintings that that illustrate the first stanza of Nuts Are Beautiful, the song that we just heard. And these are all on display at the Benton right now. This is the first one, Oh, Nobody Ever Thinks About Nuts, which is the first line of Nuts Are Beautiful. And if you look at the painting, you'll see it's clearly a self-portrait of Elizabeth with a horse chestnut coming out of her, above her head. And then there's a foam rubber tear that the chestnut is shedding a tear because nobody ever thinks about nuts. And then these are giant lips with the music score inside the lips. I did, in my interviews with Elizabeth, I did ask her, confirm that this was indeed a self-portrait. It looks like her. And in her typical coy manner, she said, well, I'll admit I was present when I painted it. The second painting is Nuts Can Be So Beautiful If Looked Aright. The third one is Take Nuts Home. And here she's affixed her red slippers to the canvas itself. Handle Them Properly Artistically is the fourth panel. And then the last one, And Feel a New Taste Being Born. And here you have this person screaming while this coconut head is emerging, giving birth to this little coconut head. And Elizabeth is off to the side here. And, you know, these are substantial works painted on masonite, and you can see them all in sequence at the Benton exhibition, as well as all of these later 1970s anthropomorphic works as well. One of the main objects of the exhibition was this nut called a coco de mer, which is a large nut found only in the Seychelles Islands in the Indian Ocean. And the nut is not only large, but it also is very suggestive of the female anatomy. Somebody gave this nut to Elizabeth about 2 years after the museum opened, so around 1974. And this became really the centerpiece of the exhibition. It was on display on this mahogany chair in the main display area of the museum. And the chair was actually something that Mrs. Trowbridge had left behind, I discovered from some archival photos. And sitting on the chair next to the nut was this guidebook to the Seychelles Islands with this photograph of a woman on the beach with the coco de mer next to her. So, you know, in case the visitor wasn't quite getting the suggestiveness of the nut, she would show them that photograph to leave little room for ambiguity. The nut became a topic of her paintings, where she talked about played with the idea of evolution, and that man was evolved from the nut, and then she would have dolls coming out of the coco de mer, emerging out of the coco de mer to suggest this kind of evolution. This is a line drawing, which is in the exhibition, which is very hard to read, but if you break it down, you can see that's the arm of the chair, the dragon on the mahogany chair. That's Elizabeth. That's the coco de mer. And then somehow between the coco de mer and the arm of the chair is this baby being born, right? Sort of emerging out of the side of this nut. If you go to the exhibition, you can see the doll, which we also were able to rescue when we saved the collection. So this is the section on the coco de mer from the exhibition. And there's the doll with other illustrative examples of her work with the coco de mer. Let me turn now to the media presence of Elizabeth, where she became the nut lady. It was a term she actually didn't particularly like. She preferred to be called a nut visionary or a nut culturist, but a lot of people called her the nut lady, and she was referred to that often in the press. She her first television appearance was in 1973, where she was a contestant on To Tell the Truth, which gave her sort of a taste of television, a taste of celebrity. And then in 1981, she appeared on The Tonight Show with Johnny Carson, which was really her first big late night interview, which is also one of her best late night interviews. We have about 45 minutes of clips in the exhibition itself that you can watch. But let me just show you a few minutes of this really classic performance by Elizabeth on Johnny Carson in October of 1981. I need to switch here to a different view.
Museum of the country devoted to nuts, and is located in.
Sorry.
My next guest, I mentioned earlier, is people in the news lately. She's an artist and founder of what is probably the only museum in the country devoted to nuts, and is located in Old Lyme, Connecticut. Would you welcome, please, Elizabeth Tashjian. Elizabeth? Welcome. Nice to have you here. Did I pronounce your last name correctly?
Perfectly.
Tashjian?
Yes.
Yeah. Now, I mentioned that when people say Nut Museum, you get all the jokes immediately, I suppose.
Oh, yes. The double meaning of the word nut.
Absolutely. And there is a... When did that first start? Do you know? Did you ever trace that back, why they refer to people who are a little off the wall as nuts?
Well, we could hark back to from 1102 to 952 BC.
Really?
Yes, way back there. According to Egyptian mythology, there was a sky goddess, a lady of heaven named Nut.
I didn't know.
So I say that
Right.
it may be the earliest personification of nut,
Yeah.
association of nut to person.
But you're talking about nuts. I mean real nuts.
Yeah, there are all kinds of nuts,
Yeah.
really.
Why did you decide to have a museum? May I call you Elizabeth?
Yes, you may.
Why did you decide to have a museum for nuts?
Well, I wish to establish the entity of the nut through art, music, history, and lore. And you'd be surprised, nuts are more than snack treats. They're treats to the soul. In fact, they've been inspiring me to paint nuts and erase the demerit mark off nuts.
Right.
You could go even that far.
You think nuts have been getting
Well,
bad
America likes
press?
nuts well enough.
Right? You're trying to lift the nut from
Exactly.
Sure. Stature deserves.
That's right. America likes nuts well enough to name streets after them.
That's right.
And even
Of course,
people,
walnut, that's probably the most
Hazel,
popular names.
a
Yes.
child is named Hazel.
Right.
And you'll find during the intercourse that they are valuable.
Probably play a major role.
You by now know I'm a spokeswoman for the nuts.
Well, you're certainly right there. How many different kinds of
Holidays are coming up pretty soon, and some people may feel lonely not being invited out to parties, but I feel that you can never be lonely when you have nuts around. Just the mere cracking of nuts spells party.
the mere cracking of
The
nuts?
mere cracking
spells
of
party.
nuts spells party.
You got
It's
it.
a deluxe playmate.
You're absolutely right. So when lonely, just go out and gather some nuts and
yes, of course. Well, you might like to start cracking.
I certainly
this one.
would. And I'm very lonely. Tell me
Oh,
what this
yes,
is. I saw
yes.
this back here. What is that?
This is,
Is that a real?
yes, this is a real nut. It is a double coconut, and it grows on palm trees that stretch up 100
You're never
feet.
alone if you have this nut. Never. Right?
I'm challenging Darwin's theory on this nut. I'm saying out with apes and in with nuts.
Out with apes, in with nuts.
Yes.
I like that. It's catchy.
Well, it took 10 years to grow and weighs 35 pounds.
And what is the name of this officially?
Double coconut.
Double?
All right, I'm gonna stop it there. You can watch the whole clip if you go to the exhibition, and I'm just gonna go back to the PowerPoint for my conclusion. All right. So the saving of the Nut Museum began in the summer of 2002, when Elizabeth was found in her home unconscious and in a coma. I was able to go inside the home after she was taken to the hospital, and as you can see from these, really sad photographs, she was living in terrible, terrible conditions. And she was taken to the hospital. The doctors thought she would not emerge from the coma, and the state immediately went to put her house on the market. They were going to sell the house with the entire contents of the house, and I was able to petition the Old Lyme probate court to let us remove all of the paintings and Nut Museum elements and papers and documents that we could find, and bring them to Connecticut College to preserve them as an archive, which the probate court allowed us to do. And then the house did sell without the contents in it. To everyone's surprise, Elizabeth woke up from the coma, and as you can imagine, was furious that she had lost her house. She was taken she was put in a nursing home in Old Saybrook in 2002, and that's where she lived the rest of her life until 2007, fighting the whole time to try to get her house back, which she was never able to. The saving of the collection, though, was a silver lining for her. She was, very pleased that that had not been sold as well, that it was brought to Connecticut College. And while she was in the nursing home, this far younger version of me was able to interview her for about 50 hours of taped conversations. And then we also were able to do 2 exhibitions while she was still alive. In 2002, we did a small exhibit at the library at Connecticut College. And then in 2004, we did a much larger exhibition at the Lyman Allen Art Museum. And she was involved in the curating of those shows, as well as sort of holding court, as you can see here at the opening of the show, which was one of the largest openings in the Lyman Allen's history. This house sold several times over the years, and I think now it's has its 4th owner currently living in the house, which has been restored and changed and doesn't really look that much like the original house that the Nut Museum was in. In the exhibition, you'll see in the biography case, which is where I started this talk this evening, we end with some discussion of Elizabeth's frustration and anger when she was in the nursing home. She wrote letters to the state, to the papers, to the probate court, trying to get her rights back and her house back. And in fact, we also have probably the last work of art that she did, which is this charcoal drawing from 2005 that she did at the nursing home, which is a picture of her shadow flashing V for victory. So she, even in her moment of defeat and sadness, she kept this passion to move on and to triumph. She died in 2007 at the age of 94. And since her passing, the collection has been preserved at Connecticut College. Over the years, I've had students archiving and scanning the collection. We have probably about 100 paintings, 50 boxes of documents, the sculptures, the coco de mer, the furnishings, most of which is on exhibit at the Benton right now. One of the things that's amazing about the archive, and we still haven't gone through everything, but every time we go through it, we find just these amazing things that have been salvaged from the past. So, for example, recently if you remember back to that painting I showed you from 1949 of Blue Bridge, we found first the snapshot, black and white snapshot that she used as the model for that painting. And then we found a watercolor first attempt to make the painting, or a draft of the painting, if you will. So, to be able to have gone through that chaotic house and save as much as possible and now put it together, back together in a way that makes sense, I think is really rewarding and very important in terms of the preservation of history, the preservation of museums, and the preservation of these ephemeral museums, that there are others like that, like her museum, that come and go unless, just by good fortune, someone is able to step up and save it for posterity. So I will end here and happily answer questions. I just want to end with this quote of Elizabeth, which I think kind of sums up a lot of her personality. "I avoid cold conventionality," which I think is certainly true of her art and her life. And I will stop sharing my PowerPoint. Thank you.
Okay, so I will read any questions that any of you may have. Just type it in the question and answer box. Right now, I only have one. It's from Jennifer Simonello, and she asks if there are any journals from George Baer that mention Elizabeth. I would be so interested to learn of his interactions with her and his thoughts of her and her works.
That's a great question, and I have not found any. I don't think he's a sort of a major figure in art history. I do have a small publication that he had a brother as well, who I think may be a little better known than he was. But one of the few things that Elizabeth told me about George Baer, who she adored and respected tremendously, was that he told her at one point when she was a young student in the early 1930s, he discouraged her from going to museums. He discouraged her from looking at other artists. And he said that he wanted her to look inside herself, and that she had so many ideas within herself that he didn't want her to be sort of contaminated. That's not the word Elizabeth used, but he didn't want her to be influenced by other artists, which is a really strange thing to tell an art student, that usually you encourage them to look at other art. So that's, that's all I know about the interactions with George Baer, but I would love to find letters. I haven't even found any letters from him in the archive, which is too bad, but thank you for that question.
The next one from Brenda Sullivan. She says, "Such a great presentation. We'll definitely go to see the exhibit. Would like to know more about her art and her religion, how her art and religion intersected," as you mentioned.
Yeah, that's a really interesting question, and it's something, as I'm working on the book project, is something I'm looking more and more into, because I knew and still know very little about Christian Science. But a lot of the performance that Elizabeth would give in the Nut Museum and the tours, she would talk about the idea that man is idea and not material. And that's, I think, one of the core tenets of Christian Science, is the idea that man is spirit, not material being. And that, I think, plays into this idea of evolution, that she was challenging Darwin's theory of man being evolved from the ape, and said it was from the nut, which she knew was, she was saying that kind of tongue in cheek. But there are instances, even in some of her TV performances, where she talks about the idea of the importance. She talks about the importance of spirit over material, and never refers to Christian Science. And I don't think anyone really knew that that's what she was referencing. But when you put it in the context of Christian Science, I think it actually, you begin to see how she's drawing connections between her religion and her art. But as I said, it's something I'm currently working on, and making those connections as I learn more about Christian Science.
Penny Dobbins asks, "What made you decide to save the Nut Museum in the first place?"
I was nuts. It's, I think, as I said, it's one of these moments where you have these really ephemeral institutions or collections, right? That would have, I mean, had I not saved it, unless you understand the context in which these paintings were made, I don't think they would be valued very much by people just coming in. And I think a lot of this would have just ended up in a dumpster outside of the home. So, you know, I thought it was important to save everything to have the context. And I had been teaching the Nut Museum as part of my museum studies courses since I came to Connecticut College in 1997. And, you know, I taught it as an example of a cabinet of curiosity. I taught it as an example of sort of getting students to think about the range of museums. When we think about museums, sometimes we just think about the Metropolitan Museum of Art and these enormous buildings with columns and marble and so on. And, you know, I think it's important to also think about the whole spectrum of museums, that there are museums that are tiny and that are in people's homes and that are ephemeral and run by one person. So I thought it was really critical to save it just as an example of that. And then because there's this whole, framework with Johnny Carson and other talk shows and the public aspect of it, I think as a kind of package, the whole thing is really an important historic moment that needed to be preserved.
Elizabeth Marlowe wants to know, how do you help your students think about the larger importance of this? What do you say when they say, why should I care about this crazy lady?
Well, what's interesting is the students that I've taught, especially the ones that were involved in doing, we did another show in 2019 with a seminar. They just fall in love with Elizabeth, even though she's, is no longer with us. There is this, I think there's this kind of connection that they draw to her passion, her living on the fringes, but, trying to kind of survive. She was a fighter in many ways, and I think students really come to respect that. And I think one of the reasons Elizabeth didn't like to be called the Nut Lady is because the Nut Lady implies that it's this crazy old lady, right? And because the students understand her full history and her full context, they don't see her that way. And as sort of in the way I answered the previous question as well, I think they understand this idea of the importance of knowing the full spectrum of museums, from the grand to the tiniest. And I think it's a great object lesson within museum studies, and then the fact that they can actually look at the actual objects just makes it even better for the students as a kind of laboratory for museum studies.
We have another question from Jalen Allen. Did you ever question if Elizabeth ever wanted to have children, get married, or even live with someone else since her mother passed away?
I didn't really discuss it that much with her. She was very clear that she did not want to get married, and part of that was her devotion to Christian Science and to God. And the other thing that I'm discovering just in the last month or so in doing the research for the book is she always referred to her father as, she had a very bad opinion of her father, who divorced when Elizabeth was 7. And it turns out the father was also abusive to the mother. And there's actually, I found a court case, 100 and some odd pages of testimony against the father by different relatives of Elmas, talking about how he abused her and pulled a gun out on her and so on. So I think her, this really traumatic childhood experience with her father also affected her relationship to men later in life.
Okay, Molly Clark Sixsmith asks, can you tell us more about the book you're writing about her?
Well, it's a long gestation period, but I'm on sabbatical this semester, so the goal is to really work on this, inspired by this exhibition being up right now. And it's the reason I think I'm having trouble with the book is I don't want it just to be a biography of Elizabeth. That I can do that within the book, but I want it to be a book that talks about the bigger issues and this idea of this idea of wonder and museums, this idea of historic preservation, the idea of small museums in America and what they tell us about American culture. So it's really trying to frame, put it in a bigger frame, and that's what I'm working on right now. And as I said, the working title is Performing the Nut Museum, which will also focus on this idea of museums as performance spaces, which is not something many people have written about. I mean, I really see she built this museum as a kind of stage for her own artistic performance. And I think that's pretty unique in the history of museums. So that's hopefully what my book will contribute.
Can't wait to read it.
Me too.
Question from Joanne Bijou. What was the process petitioning to preserve her work like? How long did it take?
It took a few weeks. We worked with the probate judge in Old Lyme, who was terrific. And it was just a matter of, not to get into the weeds with this, but it was the reason her house had been repossessed by the state is that she owed years of back taxes. She also had no health insurance. I mean, it's a tragic story, and it tells you a lot about the mistreatment of the elderly, I think, in America. But one of the issues that we had to resolve was that if they put an economic value on the price of the collection, then the state would have demanded that it be sold at auction. So they essentially had to give it to Connecticut College with a $0 value, and that's, I mean, that was like the technical thing that had to be worked out. But everyone was sort of on board that this was the right thing to do, and I think to this day everyone is very pleased with that decision.
Okay, just shifted there. Question from Nancy Pact. Did she have any interaction with her father after her parents' divorce? Did she receive any money from him?
There's boxes and boxes of legal stuff that we're still going through with her father. When he died, one of her uncles had rewritten the will so that he had cut Elizabeth out, and she had to fight that in court. There was the father. I mean, the father, whatever he did, he also seems like somewhat of a tragic figure who kind of died alone in California of a illness, unknown illness to me. But she has some correspondence with the father over the years, and there's one file that I really want to get to New York City to look at, where he had, as part of his Oriental rug business, he attended the 1935 World's Fair in New York, where they had a pavilion of carpets and Oriental rug dealers, and he had apparently one of the best displays at that 1935 World's Fair. And I have a strong suspicion that Elizabeth saw him there. And of course, I didn't know this at the time to ask her when she was still alive. It's also interesting that Dali was present at the 1935 World's Fair, and maybe that's where she was first introduced to Dali. But there's a file in the New York Public Library on M.J. Tashjian at the 1935 World's Fair, and I need to get there to read that file. Hopefully there'll be something in it of interest.
Question from Brenda Sullivan. What other odd museums have you studied? Did you know about the Museum of Bad Art in Massachusetts?
Yes, I know the Museum of Bad Art. In fact, I teach a course called Bad Art. And in that course, we look at all sorts of strange museums: the Museum of Hair, the Museum of Mustard, the Museum of painted toilet seat covers in Texas. What's interesting is I talked to Elizabeth about those offbeat museums, and she always wanted to distance herself from it. She was like, she said, no, those are, I'm a real artist. I'm not painting on toilet seats. She looked down on those museums. But but I think what happened was, when the museum opened in 1972, some of the first publications that picked up the story of the museum were these kind of guides to offbeat museums, guides to roadside America. And she just became lumped into, this, when you go to Connecticut, you go to the Nut Museum. When you're in, when you're in Illinois, you go to the world's largest ball of twine. And when you're in Texas, you go to the toilet seat museum. And she got lumped into those, even though that was not how she saw herself. She saw herself as, she actually called the museum a philosophical statement. She really saw this as something serious that was being trivialized by these roadside books. But of course, that's where most of her audience came from, was discovering her through these roadside attraction books.
Question from Jane Goldman. You mentioned that she traveled. What were some of her travels related to nuts?
She actually didn't travel that much, interestingly. I mean, as far as I know, she went to Boston to the Christian Science Mother Church. She went to, as a child, she went to Christian Science summer camp in Illinois, but I don't think she ever left the country as far as I know. Really, from 1959 on, other than flying to Los Angeles for the Johnny Carson show and that sort of thing, I don't think she traveled much for pleasure, as far as I know.
Okay, we have time for a few more. Here's a question from Adrienne de Courteviron. Was anything done during the time when she was fighting for her stuff back? Like, did she receive anything back, or was it all lost?
Well, the art and the papers we rescued and brought them to Connecticut College. And then we, because they were owned by the college, we kind of couldn't do much else with them, but we did, I did put some of her paintings in her room at the nursing home, and, retrieved them later. So she, at least was able to live with some of her paintings towards the end of her life. But she never got the home back. And that's what she really wanted. And that home, I think that home meant everything to her, because that was the home she moved in with her mother. She just adored her mother. And she associated that house with her mother. So when she was blocked from going back into the house, that was really a severe blow to her, because it really just, there was so much history in that house that was meaningful to her.
Emily Sharkus asks, were there any challenges faced in trying to recreate her space as best as possible?
Well, luckily that photograph that I showed from 1975 was taken at a, kind of a perfect angle, to that we were able to recreate it in the gallery space. Obviously, we didn't have the beautiful wood paneling that's in the original dining room, but it turns out they make wallpaper that looks a lot like wood paneling, and I was able to put the wallpaper on plywood, and then we screwed the plywood panels into the wall. There was one painting, which was one of the few paintings she ever sold. She really sold very little during her lifetime. And one of the paintings that was in that black and white photograph, that was one of the three paintings in the back of the room, was no longer in the collection because she had sold it. Fortunately, I found a snapshot color 4x6 photograph of the woman who bought the painting in the 1980s, holding it up to the camera with Elizabeth standing next to her. And I was able to scan the photograph at a high enough resolution that we could get the canvas, the image, and then have it printed at the size that the original painting was, on canvas paper and framed. So no one would ever know this, but that in fact is not the original painting in the back of the room. And then on the left side of the room, there was this sort of chicken wire with pine nuts affixed to it. And I never figured out what that was there for, but I provided my student with pine nuts and chicken wire, and she was able to recreate this exact thing. So we still don't know what it is, but it's in there. A copy of it at least is in there. So there were some challenges, but we had 95% of the material, and we're able to make replicas of the rest.
It's a question from Colleen Lucy. Were you able to interview other people to better understand her life's work, seeing that she lacked family and close friends?
I've had, a lot of interesting conversations with people who visited the museum over the years. Unfortunately, a lot of the people that show up in letters and documents that we found in the archive have passed away themselves. So, for example, another facet of Christian Science, which I didn't get into, is that her mother became a Christian Science healer, and then when her mother died, Elizabeth took over her practice as a Christian Science healer in Old Lyme and Old Saybrook. And there are many people writing to Elizabeth about, the success that they had in her healing. And I've been able to kind of track down who these people are. But, every time I track one down, they're long gone, unfortunately. So, it's one of those things where you're, 20, 30 years behind the curve in terms of being able to interview people who knew her outside the museum, but who knew her as friends and as clients of her Christian Science healing.
A question from Brenda Sullivan. Will the recording of this webinar be available to the public later so we can share it with others?
I was told, yes, there will be on the Benton Museum's YouTube channel in about a week.
Right. Let's see, go back up. Nancy Cornell asks, did she use physical nuts in collages or her paintings?
Yes, there are a few, and not in the early works, but if you look at the 5 multimedia panels that illustrate the first verse of Nuts Are Beautiful, there are sort of halved hazelnuts and walnuts that are glued as the musical notes in some cases on those panels. So yeah, that's one of the few instances where she did that. The other thing, and this kind of reminds me, I didn't really talk about this much, but there were actually not that many nuts in the museum. I think a lot of people imagined this was going to be, kind of a natural history museum about nuts and the science of nuts and the biology of nuts. She really wasn't interested in that. For her, the nut was just a starting point to start talking about other things and to talk about, mostly this idea, of being that nobody thinks about nuts, right? That nuts are overlooked. And I think that's a metaphor for her being overlooked as a person living on the fringes of society. And the nut was kind of a vehicle to get at those ideas. So if you went to the Nut Museum thinking you were going to learn a lot about the science of nuts, the nutritional value of nuts, that was not what you were going to get out of the experience.
Right. I think the other questions have already been answered by answering previous questions. That may be it. Thank you so much. Thanks to everyone for attending this virtual talk. Thank you, Chris, for an excellent, as always, lecture. And our next program, coordinating with the Nut Museum exhibition, also happens via Zoom. It's on March 1st at 6 p.m. We'll have a screening of the documentary on the Nut Museum. It's sort of Old Lyme's version of Grey Gardens. So please tune in, don't miss it, and you can sign up on the Benton Museum website.
Thank you, Nancy. Thank you to the audience who I wish I could see, but I can't. And I highly recommend the documentary by Don Bernier, In a Nutshell. It's a fantastic movie.